Great to see you again. If you joined us the last time, you heard me talk about the development of the central part of the United States, what's typically referred to as the Great Plains. And you heard me also say that the Great Plains contribution to the national American economy might loosely be described as agricultural products, whether we're talking about cattle from places like Texas or wheat from places like Kansas. In any case, today, guys, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the development of the Far West. This would be the chunk of territory that, in a lot of ways, we more or less conquered from what at one time was Mexico. This is really going to be an important part of our national economy as well. And similar to agriculture in the central part of the United States, it does have a central industry that really is defining its entire economy, and that would be mining. Okay? Now, it's no secret, and most of you probably know this, that California was placed on the map primarily because of the gold rush of the 1840s, early 1850s. It was the discovery of gold that really prompted so many people to come to California to try to strike it rich. If you're following along there with me, you're looking at the guy that's panning for gold in that river. A lot of these prospectors were doing exactly what he was doing. California is kind of open territory at this moment, and many of these people are just going there and they're literally just claiming their stakes. What they're hopeful that they're able to do is kind of skim gold off the surface level because they're simply not equipped to mine for the main deposits of that ore. They don't have heavy equipment, they don't have a workforce that's necessary for it, and they especially don't have an enormous amount of capital. What you're going to see in California is when this guy has pulled every last nugget that he possibly can out of that creek, he's going to sell his territory to the corporate interests, and you will see a corporate takeover of the mining industry in California, really all across the far west, and I'll talk about that here in a moment. But for right now, it's these companies that are really going to have the wherewithal, the capability to be able to dig down deep into the earth and find the main deposits of that gold. Now, when they were digging for gold, of course, they found other things that were very valuable to these industries back in the East. Things like copper, things like coal, things like oil, all of which were available throughout that far western territory. And not just California. You see it in Arizona, you see it in New Mexico, Nevada, parts of Colorado. There's all kinds of resources that the mining industry will produce. And similar to Texas and cattle, these are going to find homes in those industries back in the East and thereby contribute to a national economy. It's also going to stimulate immigration from abroad. Okay? The railroad industry had always been an important part of the West, the transcontinental railroad, mining industry. These are industries that are going to need thousands and thousands and thousands of workers, and the cheaper the better, the thought at the time was. And the bottom line is these are not people that are going to be native born Americans that are going to be doing this heavy backbreaking work. It's going to be people of the immigrant variety. Okay? So you'll see a little bit of internal immigration from the United States, but you're especially going to see a lot of immigration from abroad. We'll talk about that here in just a minute. For right now, I need you guys to understand what happened to San Francisco upon the discovery of gold was it was transformed into this from this sleepy little trading post town to this massive sprawling urban center. And none of that would have been possible had it not been for the Pacific Slope. Simply put, what the Pacific Slope was the Pacific Northwest, what you call present-day Oregon and Washington State. And if you think about what's available up there is these massive redwoods, right? So a lot of timber, a lot of lumber, lots of fishing, right? There's wheat that's being grown, cattle that's being raised. And what they're doing is they're raising all of these raw materials and they're sending them to California. They're sending them to San Francisco in particular. It was the Pacific Slope that essentially built the metropolis that you call San Francisco. Now, once again, everybody, all of this is predicated on the idea that nobody's living on this land. Very similar to the Plain States and the Sioux, nobody really thought too much of just going to California and stating what you felt was your territory. And of course, there are people that are living in those territories. Keep in mind that what California, Nevada, New Mexico, you name it, what it used to be before it was the southwestern part of the United States, it was Mexico, right? And in 1848, the United States is going to win this war with Mexico, and it's going to insist on taking over that part of North America. We conquered it. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo will end this war, and it will make Mexico relinquish control of those territories. And from Mexico's perspective, what it's concerned about, what will happen to those people that were living there yesterday? Yesterday they were Mexican nationals. Now what are they? And what the United States says is we will make them U.S. citizens. They've got to stay put for 1 year, but as long as you do, you will become a U.S. citizen. And we will protect your right to life, to liberty, and to your property, right? Keep in mind, the way that this is seen, the end of the war with Mexico, I mean, the way it's seen is open season on Mexican territory, right? You now have the right to go out there and claim whatever it is that you'd like. So what a lot of these people from the East begin doing is illegally occupying this Mexican American territory, right? How do you get somebody off of your land? Well, the simplest way is to sue them in court. The problem is there's not a whole lot that's cheap about going to court. And so most of these people of the Mexican American variety are rich in the sense that they own land, but they're not rich in the sense that they don't have, stacks of $100 bills lining their kitchen cabinets. What they'll do is they'll parcel out their land in order to satisfy some of their legal debt. And so, whether by hook or by crook, what you begin to see is the erosion of a Mexican American land ownership class in the Southwest. And most of those people would probably describe themselves as farmers in terms of their occupation. What happens to a farmer when you take away his ability to have access to the land? Well, you ruin his career as a farmer. And so what you're getting at here, guys, would be a situation where people are pretty desperate by the 1870s, 1880s. When the coal companies came, when the railroad companies came, you had a very impoverished local population that was more than happy to sell its labor cheap and very, easy to manipulate, sell its labor to the railroad companies, to the mining companies. And so in addition to all of the land, what those corporations got was a very cheap, docile labor force at the same time. I guess simply put, the same thing that happened to the Sioux, being marginalized, shoved to the side, and inequality emanating because of this event, that same thing would happen to Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the far West. It's also going to stimulate immigration. For the same reason that we were talking about in this, in the Eastern context, it's industrialization. There are jobs out there. And similar to the East, there are things that are going on in other parts of the world that would later send immigrants to the West that are pushing them out. Example, we're going to see a lot of immigration from Latin America, and especially Mexico. And if you know anything about Mexican history, you can tell me that it's the middle of the Mexican Revolution at this particular moment, late 19th, early 20th century. And it's this war that's pushing many, many people out of Mexico just to simply escape the crossfire. The Mexican economy is changing as well and never really, really recovered from that war with the United States. And a lot of people are seeking an economic asylum in the North. We're seeing a lot of immigration from China, Eastern and Southern Asia. Guangdong province in particular is suffering from enormous amounts of flood, famine resulting from all of this as well. And so, similar to the Italians that lost their land through another process, you see thousands and thousands of Chinese that are beginning to emigrate to the United States to take advantage of this growing, booming industry that is known as mining. And just like in New York, it's not as if we throw open our doors and say, come one, come all. We're going to process immigrants from Latin America in this checkpoint that we call El Paso. El Paso is going to serve as the southwestern Ellis Island for these immigrants coming in from Latin America. And similar to Ellis Island, it's going to be a tremendous or a traumatic experience, but with a little bit more racism sprinkled in there for good measure. And of course, I mean that in a bad way. There were assumptions that were made about these people that were coming from Latin America. Much of this is based on racism. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that the experience in El Paso, if this is even possible, is probably even more traumatic, more intense than it was in Ellis Island. I think you could say the same thing for Angel Island. Angel Island was off the coast of California, and it was the checkpoint for millions of new Americans that were arriving from Eastern Asia. And similar to the situation that you have in El Paso, there were all of these assumptions, racist assumptions, that were being made about these people that were coming from Eastern Asia. That they ate rats or they practiced these hedonistic sort of customs, none of which would dovetail very well with the native born American population. They brought these strange religions, or what Americans consider to be strange religions. Maybe most importantly of all, they had these unfair business practices that would translate into advantages in the marketplace, and we certainly couldn't allow that to stand. So Angel Island was probably even more intense, maybe even more intense than El Paso when it comes to how you experienced it. One example before we move on. What you would do from the boat ride from China to San Francisco was you would study these letters that were sent from San Francisco, from Chinese immigrants in San Francisco back to China. And you'd study them just hour after hour after hour after hour on your ride over to California. But the reason that you were studying them is because, similar to Ellis Island, these immigration officials would be asking you questions, and you better know the answers to them, right? You better know what Chinese labor boss in San Francisco you're going to work for, and if you didn't know specifically, then you would want to have an answer that they have heard of, they had seen before, that would pass the eyeball test to get you in. And so my point is this process of studying these letters back from California was it gave these new immigrants a paper identity. And these immigrants came to be known as the paper sons. They had made up names and made up lives for the most matter. They existed on paper, but their identities were paper thin. Hence, we have the term paper sons. But whether we're talking about immigrants from Japan or China or Mexico, everybody was headed to Gold Mountain. And what Gold Mountain really was California. The thought was everybody in Gold Mountain was getting rich. Except it was much more complicated than that, similar to Jurgis Rudkus in Chicago. We found out that the streets were not, in fact, paved with gold, and everyone was not, in fact, getting rich. And on top of those very big, problematic complications, you also had a xenophobic backlash, racist backlash, to the onslaught of massive amounts of immigration and demographic changes. All of these newcomers were the subject of this derision, this backlash, but it was really the Chinese that bore the brunt of it. Um, Millions of Chinese coming over to California, the United States generally, and what they're going to do is they're going to be instrumental in the laying of the transcontinental railroad. I mean, without labor from China, that would not have happened. They'll be absolutely essential to the mining industry. In other words, they provide this really critical service at this critical moment. But because they're willing to work for so cheap, most native born Americans are assuming that there's something that's not exactly on the up and up that's going on. And that's another very important reason as to why the Chinese were so reviled when it comes to an immigrant group coming in. In 1882, we will see all of this come to a head. And one group that's going to bring it to a head is, if you're following along with me online, the PowerPoint, there's that boot that's kicking out that Chinese immigrant, and on the boot is the acronym WPC, Working Men's Party of California. Now, the WPC was a political organization But similar to the Green Party or the Libertarian Party, it was never big enough or important enough to really be taken serious in an election. What it did was influence the outcome of elections. Now, what the WPC wanted to see happen was a complete ban on immigration from China in the future, right? And no, they were never really a serious contender to win the governorship or a Senate seat from California. You couldn't get elected dog catcher as a Democrat or a Republican. You couldn't get elected to any kind of political post unless you at least went through the lip service, gave lukewarm attention to the idea that Chinese immigration would be addressed if you were to be elected. In other words, the WPC loses, but it essentially wins, right? It wins in the sense that in 1882, Congress capitulates and they pass another one of these racist, nasty, terrible laws called the Chinese Exclusion Act. What this said was that Chinese immigration here from this point forward would really no longer be allowed to continue. There would only really be three exceptions. One, businessmen will still continue to take your money. Students, you could send students to the universities over here in the United States. And lastly, diplomats. But aside from that, nobody else was really welcome. And because students, diplomats, and businessmen were a tiny, tiny minority of the people coming from China, we essentially shut down Chinese immigration altogether. Okay? Now, if you need to hear me say that the Irish were not treated very well, and later on the Italians were not treated very well, and later on the Mexicans were not treated very well, that's all very true. But before this, we've never really specifically targeted a national group of people and said that your kind is no longer welcome here. And similar to some of the issues that we're going through in the early, semi early part of the 21st century, a ban on immigrants coming from a specific part of the world. We've seen it. We've actually seen this before, and you see it in the case of the Chinese coming to California. But even for those Chinese that had come before the ban, life got a lot more complicated. I would be willing to guess that many of you have been to a Chinatown at some part of the United States. New York, believe there's one in Dallas, certainly there's one in San Francisco. What Chinatown was in San Francisco was not the romanticized place where you had lunch and went shopping. It was not a tourist destination. What Chinatown was in San Francisco was the only part of the city that the Chinese were allowed to exist. Even if you were relatively well to do, even if you'd been successful in the market. It wasn't as simple as, well, I think I'll go buy a house in this swanky part of the city. You weren't welcome there. And the only place that they were allowed to exist would be Chinatown. And essentially, what they had was second class citizenship, right? It wasn't just that you couldn't go anywhere else in the city, but there were certain things that were just patently off limits to you. Chinatown's a good example of racism, right? It's not much different at all than Jim Crow back in the East, separate and unequal, and there's certain things that are just off limits to specific groups and specific demographics of Americans. We've been talking a lot about the northern part of California. Keep in mind it's the north that is bringing this innovation with respect to mining. We haven't talked much about the south. And what the south had was an enormous amount of sunshine. And I never really knew this until I began to research for this lecture, but California produces more agricultural output than any other state in the country, right? You don't really think of California when it comes to that specific kind of production, but you do. It's producing specialty crops, things like raisins, almonds, citrus fruits, peaches, that sort of thing. Part of the reason for that, Napa Valley, um, is it's got a very unique climate. I mean, it's really the only part of North America that's got a real Mediterranean climate. It's part of the reason why you see so much production of wine in California. Um, but it's going to be people of the immigrant variety that are going to be doing the backbreaking labor that is going to be so instrumental in the production of these specialty crops. Unlike the North that saw a lot of Chinese immigration and labor, It's going to be Japanese immigration and labor that's doing most of the heavy lifting. And the same kind of anti Chinese attitudes that existed in the North, you're going to see anti Japanese attitudes exist in the South. And it kind of begs the question, how and why do you not have a Japanese Exclusion Act? You got a Chinese Exclusion Act, why not a Japanese Exclusion Act? And the answer is Japan is becoming a first world country. It's developing a powerful military, its economy is evolving, and what it says in short order to the United States is you're not going to do to us what you've done to China. You're not going to make us the laughing stock of the world. It's not going to happen. And so you don't have a formal ban on Japanese labor. What you'll have in places like Los Angeles is a gentleman's agreement not to employ Japanese labor, right? That the same thing that the Chinese suffered from, the idea that they were taking jobs from, quote unquote, real Americans, um, that will exist in Southern California with respect to the Japanese as well. But you're never going to formalize it the same way that you do with the Chinese. It would just be a known but not necessarily stated policy. But you still need somebody to do the backbreaking work. And that's where you begin to see the use on Mexican labor, right? Mexican labor in the citrus fruit industry, Mexican labor to knock all of the nuts out of the walnut tree or the cashew tree, and then do the backbreaking work of gathering them off of the ground. Had it not been for Mexican labor, we don't really have an answer to who's doing the heavy lifting in California's agricultural industry. Now, the last thing that I want you to be mindful of before I let you go would be the environmental consequences for the industrialization of the Far West. Keep in mind, those Native Americans that were living in the Far West, they were nomadic peoples. And the reason that they were nomadic was because we're not talking about, what is now North Carolina or Tennessee. It would not support agriculture because you're just not getting the rain. They moved from place to place. And you see this complicated irrigation system that is introduced to the West, California, but elsewhere as well. And it's really artificially allowing just a handful of farmers to produce in a part of the country that otherwise would not be producing anything in the way of agriculture. You've got these railroad companies that are coming in and just blasting through mountains. You've got mining companies that are ripping the hillsides to shreds, right? And one individual that took exception to all of this is the guy that you're looking at the bottom of the screen there, a naturalist by the name of John Muir. John Muir had a PhD in biology, and he is a very early advocate of what you and I would call environmental protectionism. That the environment cannot speak up for itself, but what these companies are doing, in his mind, is irreversible damage to, he thought of California as sort of this open air, laboratory. And it was doing ecological damage that might not be reversible. And so what he does is he appeals to the federal government. He appeals to the federal government to protect the environment, to place it under the protection of the federal government. That even though you might be able to get rich from drilling in this part of California or that part of Oregon, the federal government's not going to allow you to do that. And we still have that debate as to whether or not we should drill in parts of Alaska or whether or not we should, continue the practice that has come to be known as fracking, that sort of thing, right? John Muir is an early voice that says we ought to be protecting or doing more to protect the environment. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that John Muir won every fight that he ever undertook. I mean, obviously, he's up against some pretty big odds, lots of money and lots of power stacked on the business side of all of this. What I will say is that John Muir is going to become father of what we call the Sierra Club, this national, before it was even national, state park system in places like California, Sequoia National Park, Grant, Yosemite National Park. All of these things trace their roots back to John Muir. And what John Muir essentially did was convince eventually friendly politicians, probably Theodore Roosevelt's the best example we can point to, people that thought of the environment as very important, convinced them of the need to actually protect it. And so John Muir is going to be successful in various ways, and he's willing to play the long game when it comes to waiting on that success. You'll see what I'm talking about once we enter this time period known as the Progressive Era. And it's not just Muir, but it's also another guy, another naturalist by the name of Gifford Pinchot, that will get in the ear of President Roosevelt and convince him that not only do we need to protect the woods and the water and the wilderness, but we need to do so because we've got to protect our natural commodities. That this was national self-protection that was essentially at stake. And so that's where we're going to leave it for today. At this point, I'm hopeful that you're able to see that every region of the United States is bringing something unique in terms of industry into what might be called a national economy. I'll see you later.